Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and in this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the Zaporizhia direction where the Russians continue their offensive operation. According to different pro-Russian reliable sources, the Russians, as a result of several attacks, managed to establish control over several strongholds to the north of the line between Nestyryanka and Rabotino. At least according to pro-Russian source military expert Riber, this small stronghold was captured by the Russians. The thing is that the first report about this offensive was received on the 26th of September. This is it. The Russian sources have already reported about additional progress on the ground, and just today we see some changes on according to different mappers. So most likely the Russians managed to finish the securing operation. Furthermore, the mappers reported that as a result of offensive, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the northeastern direction from the village of Rabotino. So these fields were also captured by the Russians. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Vuhledar direction, where we continue receiving significant number of very interesting details and updates. First, let's talk about Vuhledar itself. For the previous 3 days, we haven't received anything from the territory of the city. We are talking about artillery strikes or heavy aviation strikes, and starting on the 29th of September, the sources continue publishing updates about the way the Russians are bombing and attacking this territory. For example, in this video we can see the Russian drone that was heading towards the stronghold of Vuhledar, and we see how the Russians resume their bombing, artillery and aviation bombing of the citadel. So what is happening? I'll remind you that for the previous few days the Russians were trying to conduct negotiations with the Ukrainians on the terms of surrendering, but most likely in the end of this negotiation process the Ukrainians refuse to surrender. Maybe the Ukrainians are waiting for additional reinforcements or something like unblocking operation, which most likely is unlikely is not going to happen. And also we have a lot of very interesting updates from this foothold itself and from the village of Bogayavlenka. The Ukrainian sources are saying that the Russians, while negotiation process, were transferring additional forces in the area of Vuhledar, and the Russian Federation, according to sources, transferred up to 5,000 Russian soldiers to Vuhledar. So that was stated by former Mariupol city hall. We're talking about pro-Ukrainian one. So once again, while there was a negotiation process during the previous 3 days operational pause, the Russians were concentrating additional forces, and obviously we understand that these 5,000 soldiers is enough to make a small but local breakthrough towards the village of Bogayavlenka, maybe with the results of taking the village of Bogayavlenka and Novoukrayinka under complete control. Furthermore, we have very interesting report from very reliable pro-Ukrainian sources. The very reliable pro-Ukrainian sources reported that fighting continues in the city center. Furthermore, it was not possible to stop the advance of the Russian armed forces on the flanks. We are talking about the line between Prichistovka and Novoukrayinka and about the line Vodyane-Bogayavlenka as well. Furthermore, he added that the occupiers continue their movements from Prichistovka and Vodyane to Bogayavlenka, the shortest distance to which is 1.5 kilometers. And this is the most important piece of news for the previous night, for the previous 12 hours. Let's discuss this in details. If we calculate the distance between the village of Bogayavlenka and, let's say, the edge Russian positions in the South Donbass, coal mine number 3, in this case the distance is around a little bit less than 5 kilometers. If we calculate the distance between Bogayavlenka and the Russian foothold to the north of the river Kashlagach, then in this case the distance is around 6.3 kilometers, and according to this post the shortest distance to which is 1.5 kilometers. So which means that during the previous 3 days, while the Russians were conducting something like negotiation process with the Ukrainians, the main Russian forces were moving on the flanks, and the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. If we try to project the distance of 1.5 kilometers on the flanks to the village of Bogoyavlenka, then most likely the Russians have already reached this line. So this is already 2 kilometers on the western flank, and this is around 1.8 kilometers on the eastern flank. So summarizing everything according to very reliable pro-Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian resource, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to reach this salient and to get as close as possible to the main line between the village of Novoukrayinka and Bogoyavlenka. So this is most likely the Russian progress on the western flank. I'm not sure whether the Russians were moving on the eastern flank, because there are some facilities between mine number 3 and Bogoyavlenka itself. We're talking about these facilities and these facilities, and if the Russians capture these facilities, then obviously the Russians would post about this. Most likely the Russians mainly have progress exactly along the fields, and this is very interesting. Furthermore, as for the Ukrainsk itself, the sources reported that today the Russians will give the Ukrainians an ultimatum to surrender. So the time has ended. Obviously, for Ukrainians, most likely the Ukrainians would not be able to escape the encirclement anymore. So today there are going to be the ultimatum, and if Ukrainians reject ultimatum, then the Russians most likely will reduce the city of Vuhledar completely till ruins. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kurakhove direction. The Russian sources published very interesting video. In this video we can see the railway bridge that goes from the northern bank of Kurakhove reservoir to the southern one, and this bridge was destroyed or attacked or damaged by the Russian missile. So this is the moment when the missile reached the target. So the Russians are trying to reduce logistics, obviously. Now let's talk about Tsukurino. We received significant number of updates exactly from this area, and we've been receiving lots of very interesting details and changes on the ground for the previous 3 days. First, before we continue, let's take a look how the situation was have been developing for the previous 3 days. So this is the situation on the 29th of September, and this is the situation on the 28th of September, and this is the line of combat contact on the 27th. So as you can see, during the previous 3 days, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Once again, by the beginning of the 27th of September, the Russians managed to answer the town of Girnak from the north. On the 28th of September, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly in the direction of Selidov. We've been discussing this Russian offensive operation yesterday. Once again, and now let's talk about the progress on the 29th of September, and by the morning of the 29th we see significant Russian progress to the west and to the east and to the southwest of the village of Tsukurino. The Russians took under control this stronghold, and the Russians managed to answer the mine and the Terikon of the by the name of Святителя Василия Великого. So this is the progress of the Russians during the previous 24 hours. Obviously the progress is very important, and basically the Russians managed to cut the lines between the village of Tsukurino and the town of Girnak. Some sources reported that most likely the Russians are going to continue moving in the southern direction towards the village of Izmailovka. Probably we're going to receive additional updates just tomorrow, but as for now we see that Tsukurino was captured in pincers. Now the Russians have chances to develop significant results by attacking the southern direction along the railways, and from the mine also in the northwestern direction. So something tells me that within the next 3 days the village of Tsukurino would be captured by the Russians completely, and this is going to be another step to the complete disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine. As for Selidov itself, during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their positions in the area they managed to capture yesterday. So additional 3 lines, additional fortifications were taken by the Russians, and during the previous night we got very interesting video from the central part of Selidov, and some mappers suggested to adjust the map in Russian favor, but I'm not sure we should do this. In this video we can see Russian biker that was moving almost in the central part of Selidov, and in this part of the video he was heading in the southern direction. So summarizing everything, the Russian biker was moving using along these streets, and he was moving further in the southern direction. And a lot of mappers suggested that it's better to make changes on the ground and to add under complete Russian control something like this. I'm not sure we need to do this. Maybe this is something like a mistake. Maybe this is a wrong video. Maybe the Ukrainians, let's say, missed something or something like this. Because if this is the real situation on the ground, then Selidova is done. It's like we should start counting days before the entire city falls in the complete Russian control. So anyway, let's keep an eye on this situation, on this sector of Selidova, because something weird and interesting obviously is happening there. Furthermore, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions between Novogrodovka and Marinovka. Additional 3 lines fortifications were captured by the Russians. As you can see, they managed to improve their positions in the southwestern direction of Marinovka, and the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southwestern direction of Novogrodovka. So the Russians are getting closer and closer to the northern part of the city of Selidova. As for the Pokrovsk direction, we haven't received anything special during the previous 24 hours and during the previous 12 hours tonight. Now let's talk about the dense network of the fortifications to the west of New York. We've been talking a lot about the situation, and we came to the conclusion that currently there are very heavy clashes between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And as you can see, during the previous night, the Russians managed to improve their positions and take another dense network of the fortifications under complete control. Let's take a look at the situation in dynamic. This is the situation on the 26th of September. The Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to counterattack the Russians with the purpose to slow them down, but most of those attacks were repelled by the Russian FPV drone operators. When the Ukrainians basically lost their reserves, the Russians continue moving further, and by the 27th of by the morning of the 28th of September, the Russians managed to secure these positions and this complex network of the fortifications. And by the morning of the 29th of September, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly and to take under control these trenches, these strongholds. So this is the movement of the Russians for the previous 48 hours. Obviously, the Russians are not going to stop, and now they will move further in the western direction with the purpose to complete the battle for this complex network of the fortifications. Now let's talk about the city of Toretsk. There are very heavy clashes. The Russians are moving, and during the previous 24 hours, the Russians also managed to improve their positions. This is the situation on the yesterday's evening, 28th of September, and this is the additional gains on the ground. So as a result of offensive, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the village of Nilipovka. This information was confirmed by different mappers, and the Russians managed to improve their positions around the citadel and getting closer and closer to the main Ukrainian citadel. We're talking about this mine of Toretsk Vuhledar, and the Russians improved their positions around the Terikont of Nova and in this small block. So the Russians are moving closer and closer to the final days of the Toretsk. Furthermore, the sources published some additional videos of the consequences of Russian attacks. In this video, we can see the city of Toretsk itself heavily damaged and suffered significant losses and ruins since the beginning of the battle. Obviously, by the end of the battle for Toretsk, the city would be reduced probably in 50% to ruins. Now let's move further and let's continue with the Kupyansk offensive operation. Third day in a row, the Ukrainian sources continue publishing different videos of how they were repelling Russian attacks. Significant losses of the armored forces of Russian Federation, significant number of vehicles, personnel was destroyed as a result of Russian offensive. I'll remind you that this Russian attack took place 3 days ago, and the Ukrainians were expecting that the Russians would begin another one, but yet nothing has started from the Russian side, which means that the Russians did suffer significant losses. They're regrouping and probably they're changing their plans. Now let's talk about the Kursk direction. The second day in a row, we continue receiving updates about very heavy clashes for the village of Sverdlikova. There were fights at night. The Russian sources reported the Ukrainian armored forces lost several units of equipment and personnel. The Ukrainian armored forces deny losses and the attack by the Russian army. The thing is that the sources report about very heavy clashes, that Ukrainians lost a lot of everything, but the problem is that the Russians neither managed to take a foothold on the territory of the village, so which means that Ukrainians introduced additional reinforcements and reserves in this direction on this line with the purpose not to allow the Russians to break through this defense. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.